She betrayed her husband in the moment the thunder shook the glass walls of their master living room, right under the unblinking red gaze of the security cameras, and I will never forget the way her eyes looked, darker than the storm raging outside, when she decided that ruining her marriage was worth the risk of ruining my life. It wasn't just a betrayal of vows. It was a calculated demolition of the boundaries that were supposed to keep a guy like me, a broke 24-year-old gardener, away from a woman like Elena Grayson. The air in that house was always cold, filtered, and sterile, but that night, the atmosphere was so thick with tension and humidity that it felt like we were underwater, drowning in a secret that hadn't even been fully spoken yet, but was already screaming to be let out. I should have run the moment I saw her car in the driveway, but by then, the trap had already snapped shut, and I was just the prey waiting to be devoured. To understand why I froze instead of bolting, you have to understand the house. The Grayson estate isn't just a home. It's a fortress of glass and steel, controlled by a smart home system that costs more than my entire college tuition. Robert Grayson, Elena's husband, is a tech mogul with a paranoia streak a mile wide. He has cameras in the hallways, sensors on the windows, and a log of every door that opens and closes. I was only supposed to be there to water the exotic indoor ferns while they were on a 2-week vacation in the Swiss Alps. But that afternoon, a torrential downpour had turned the garden into a mud pit. I was soaked to the bone, shivering and covered in grime. The house was empty, warm, and inviting. I made a stupid choice, the kind of choice that starts horror movies. I decided to use the downstairs guest shower to rinse off before driving home in my beat-up sedan. I told myself it was harmless. Robert and Elena were thousands of miles away. The system was set to house sitter mode. I was invisible. Or so I thought. The shower was a lapse in judgment that felt too good to regret at the moment. The hot water pounded against my back, washing away the mud and the stress of my double shifts. I used the expensive sandalwood soap that smelled like money and power, letting the steam fill the bathroom until the mirrors fogged over. For 20 minutes, I wasn't the hired help. I was just a man enjoying a luxury he could never afford. I turned off the water, the silence of the large house rushing back in to replace the hiss of the pipes. Wrapping a small, fluffy white towel around my waist, the only thing I could find, I stepped out into the hallway to grab my clothes from the laundry room where I had thrown them in the dryer. I was vulnerable, exposed, and completely off guard. I didn't even hear the front door open over the sound of the thunder cracking directly overhead. I just walked into the living room, water dripping from my hair onto the polished marble floor, and the room suddenly flooded with light. The welcome home protocol had initialized. And there, standing by the wet bar, clutching a glass of scotch like a lifeline, was Elena. She wasn't in Switzerland. She was 10 feet away from me. And she wasn't the poised, untouchable trophy wife I usually saw from a distance while I mowed the lawn. Her designer coat was thrown carelessly on the floor. Her hair was damp and messy, plastered to her neck. She looked wild, agitated, and terrifyingly beautiful. I froze, my hand clutching the knot of the towel at my hip so hard my knuckles turned white. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. I was going to be fired. I was going to be sued. Robert Grayson would destroy me. "Mrs. Grayson," I stammered, my voice cracking, stepping back toward the shadows. I'm so sorry. I thought you were. I couldn't even form a coherent excuse. The smart lights adjusted automatically, dimming to a warm amber hue, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. It felt intimate, too intimate. Elena didn't scream. She didn't reach for her phone to call the police. She didn't even blink. She just took a slow sip of her drink, her eyes dragging down my body, lingering on my chest, my stomach, and the precarious knot of the towel. "Robert stayed in Zurich for business," she said, her voice low and raspy, devoid of the usual polite condescension she used with staff. "I came back early. I hate the snow." She took a step toward me. The click of her heels on the marble echoed like gunshots. I looked up at the ceiling corner. The camera lens was there, a tiny black eye with a blinking red LED. Panic surged through me. "Mrs. Grayson, the cameras," I whispered urgently, pointing up. "If Mr. Grayson sees me like this, if he sees us." It was a plea for self-preservation. Robert was known for his jealous rages. Everyone in the staff knew the rumors. If he checked the feed and saw his young gardener half-naked with his wife, I was dead meat. But Elena didn't look at the camera. She looked straight into my eyes, and a cruel, amused smile played on her lips. She knew exactly where the blind spots were, and she knew exactly how much power she held in that moment. Robert is currently in a meeting, and he rarely checks the living room feed unless the motion sensors trigger an alarm, she said, walking closer until I could smell the rain and expensive perfume on her skin. She was circling me now, like a shark that had scented blood in the water. I backed up until my bare shoulders hit the cold glass of the sliding patio door. Lightning flashed, illuminating her silhouette against me. I was trapped between the storm outside and the woman inside. "You're trembling, Leo," she noted softly, reaching out. Her finger, cool and manicured, traced the line of water dripping down my sternum. My breath hitched. It was an electric shock that went straight to my groin. This was wrong. This was dangerous. But my body was betraying my brain. "I should go," I managed to choke out, making a move to sidestep her toward my clothes. "I need to get dressed." Elena moved faster than I expected. She slammed her hand against the glass next to my head, blocking my escape. Her face was inches from mine, her breathing heavy, her eyes dilated. The mask of the perfect wife had completely slipped, revealing a hunger that terrified me. She looked down at the towel again, then back up at me, her expression hardening into a command that left no room for negotiation. The air between us was so charged it felt like the lightning was inside the room. "You're not going anywhere," she whispered, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a mix of authority and desire. "And as for getting dressed," her hand moved from the glass to the knot of my towel, her fingers hovering right over the fabric, ready to pull. "Don't you dare cover up. I want to see exactly what I'm paying for." She didn't pull the towel. Not yet. Instead, Elena let her hand hover there, a suspended threat that was far more terrifying than the action itself, while a slow, satisfied smile spread across her lips as she watched me flinch. The air in the living room felt suddenly too thin to breathe, charged with the ozone of the storm outside and the radiation of her gaze inside. "Relax, Leo," she purred, though her eyes were anything but relaxing. They were predatory, scanning me like I was a prize she had just won at an auction I didn't know I had entered. She finally withdrew her hand, not to push me away, but to grab my wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong. Her nails dug into my skin, grounding me in the reality of the danger I was in. "Move," she commanded, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the low rumble of thunder. "The cameras sweep the living room every 60 seconds. Unless you want Robert to get a notification of intruder in towel, you'll come with me." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and pulled me, stumbling and barefoot, out of the open living space and into the shadows of the hallway. We moved through the house like thieves, avoiding the patches of light cast by the lightning flashes through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I was acutely aware of my nakedness, of the vulnerability of my bare feet on the cold stone, and of the absurdity of the situation, me, the gardener who scraped mud off his boots, being led by the lady of the manor into the dark recesses of a multi-million-dollar estate. She stopped abruptly in a narrow alcove beneath a floating staircase, an architectural quirk that created a deep, triangular shadow hidden from the digital eyes of the security system. It was a dead zone, a blind spot in Robert's panopticon. Elena pressed me back against the rough texture of the decorative slate wall, her body following instantly, closing the distance until I could feel the heat radiating from her through the thin fabric of her blouse. Here, in the dark, the dynamic shifted again. The fear of immediate exposure to the cameras vanished, replaced by a suffocating, intoxicating intimacy. We were hidden, but we were trapped together. "He watches everything," she murmured, her voice laced with bitterness as she glanced out toward the illuminated foyer where the red light of a camera blinked rhythmically. "He checks the logs. He counts the times the doors open. But he forgets about the shadows." She looked back at me, her expression softening into something raw and desperate. She reached out and placed her palm flat against my chest, right over my heart. I knew she could feel it hammering against my ribs, betraying every ounce of adrenaline flooding my system. "You're so warm," she whispered, sounding almost surprised. "Robert is always so cold. His hands, his skin, it's like sleeping next to a statue." This was the first crack in her armor, a confession that transformed the moment from a power play into a shared secret. The symbol of her control, the house, was now the very thing pushing her toward me. She wasn't just a bored wife. She was a prisoner seeking warmth in the only place she wasn't supposed to look. Suddenly, a bright beam of light swept across the adjacent room, slicing through the darkness and illuminating the edge of our hiding spot. My muscles locked up. Outside, the tires of a heavy vehicle crunched on the wet gravel of the driveway. "Security patrol," I hissed, panic seizing my throat. If they saw lights or movement, they would come in. Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she pressed her body fully against mine, forcing me deeper into the shadows, effectively shielding me with her own silhouette. "Stay still," she breathed against my neck, her lips brushing the sensitive skin below my ear. The sensation sent a shockwave through me that had nothing to do with fear. The patrol car idled outside, its spotlight searching the windows. In that suspended moment, with the threat of discovery just through the glass, the tension between us snapped. The danger wasn't a deterrent anymore, it was an accelerant. Her hand drifted lower, her fingers tracing the damp waistband of my towel, testing the tension of the fabric again. Just as the patrol car began to pull away, the silence of our hiding spot was shattered by a violent buzzing. It was coming from her clutch on the floor. The screen lit up the darkness, with a harsh white glow, displaying a name that made my stomach drop. "Husband." The phone vibrated aggressively against the stone floor, a digital demand for attention that echoed like a siren. Elena looked down at it, her face illuminated by the ghostly light of the screen, highlighting the conflict in her eyes. For a second, I thought she would answer, apologize, and send me away. But then she looked back at me, her pupils dilated, and kicked the phone over, turning it face down. The buzzing continued, muffled but persistent, a rhythmic reminder of the line we were towing. "Let it ring," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She leaned in, her mouth hovering inches from mine, the smell of scotch and rain overwhelming my senses. "I want to see if you're brave enough to ignore him too." She raised her hands to my face, pulling me down, her intention clear. We were seconds away from a kiss that would seal my fate and destroy her marriage. My resistance was melting under the heat of her touch and the insane adrenaline of the situation. I leaned in, surrendering to the madness. But before our lips could touch, a robotic, disembodied voice from the ceiling speakers froze the blood in my veins. The security system had bypassed the silent mode. "Motion detected, master bedroom. Access authorized." We both jerked back, eyes wide. The master bedroom was upstairs. We were downstairs. And Robert was supposed to be in Zurich. Someone was in the house, walking above our heads, and the system had just welcomed them. The disembodied voice of the security system announcing unauthorized access to the master bedroom hung in the air like a death sentence, freezing us both in the darkness under the stairs. For a split second, I saw genuine terror in Elena's eyes, the first crack in her confident facade since she'd walked in on me, before she blinked it away, replacing fear with a cold, sharp calculation. "The cat," she whispered, though it sounded more like a prayer than a statement. "It has to be Whiskey. He sets off the sensors if he jumps on the bed, but Robert usually keeps that door shut." She grabbed my arm again, her nails digging in harder this time, dragging me not toward the exit, but toward the grand staircase. My brain screamed at me to run, to bolt for the back door, and sprint into the rain until my lungs burned, but my body was tethered to her. We ascended the stairs in silence, moving like ghosts, the wet slap of my bare feet on the steps drowned out by the thunder rattling the skylights. Every shadow looked like a man waiting to ambush us. Every creak of the house sounded like a loaded gun. When we reached the double doors of the master bedroom, they were slightly ajar. Elena pushed them open with a trembling hand, and the relief that washed over me was so intense it nearly knocked me to my knees. There was no husband holding a shotgun, no security team. Just a large, fluffy Persian cat sitting in the middle of a king-size bed that looked big enough to land a plane on, licking its paw with absolute indifference. The intruder was a pet. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for an hour, leaning against the doorframe, clutching my towel. "It's just the cat," I exhaled, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Mrs. Grayson, please. I'm pressing my luck. I need to leave before the system alerts him again." This was my choice, the moment I could have walked away. The adrenaline had faded enough for sanity to return. But Elena wasn't looking at the cat anymore. She was looking at me, standing in the doorway of her marital sanctuary, half naked and shivering. And in that look, the dynamic shifted violently from relief back to predation. She didn't answer me. Instead, she walked over to the nightstand, picked up a remote, and pressed a button. The heavy blackout curtain slid shut over the panoramic windows, sealing us in, and the door lock engaged with a loud, mechanical click that echoed like a prison cell closing. "You're not leaving, Leo," she said softly, turning to face me. The room was now dimly lit by the ambient glow of the bedside lamps, casting the massive bed in a golden haze. This room was a temple to her husband's ego, austere, expensive, and utterly devoid of warmth. But Elena was the fire in the center of it. She walked toward me, her gaze dropping to the towel, then back up to my eyes. "Do you know why I came back early?" she asked, stepping so close I had to retreat backward until the back of my knees hit the mattress. "Because being in this house with him, it's like being part of the collection. I'm just another expensive thing he owns, like the art, like the cars. But you—" She placed her hands on my shoulders and pushed. I lost my balance and fell back onto the silk sheets, Robert's sheets. "You look at me like I'm dangerous." The sensation of the silk against my bare back was electric, a tactile shock of luxury and taboo. I was lying in my boss's bed, his wife looming over me, her hair falling like a curtain around our faces. The symbol of their marriage, this bed, was transforming into the altar of its destruction. "Elena, stop!" I whispered, using her first name for the first time, a transgression that felt heavier than the act itself. "If he calls, if he checks—" She straddled my legs, not touching me intimately yet, but pinning me down with her weight, establishing dominance. "Let him check," she hissed, her face inches from mine. "I want to feel something real, Leo. I want you to make me forget who owns this bed." She reached down, her fingers brushing the knot of my towel again, and this time there was no hesitation. I was paralyzed by a mix of terror and an overwhelming dark desire. I wanted this. God help me, I wanted the disaster as much as the pleasure. But the universe has a wicked sense of timing. Just as her hand slipped beneath the fabric, a shrill, digital trill pierced the silence of the room. We both froze. It wasn't a phone. It was the iPad Pro resting on the nightstand, angled directly at the bed. The screen lit up, flooding the dim room with harsh blue light, and the caller ID flashed a photo that made my blood run cold. Robert FaceTime request. The sound was deafening in the quiet room, a demand that couldn't be ignored. If she didn't answer, he would check the cameras immediately. If she did answer, I was right there. Elena looked at the screen, then at me, her eyes wide with a frantic energy that bordered on madness. She didn't get up. She didn't tell me to hide on the floor. A wicked idea seemed to dawn on her, a way to raise the stakes to a level I couldn't comprehend. She put a finger to her lips, signaling absolute silence. "Don't move," she mouthed. Then, with a shaking hand, she reached out and tapped the green accept button, angling the iPad just enough so that it framed only her face and shoulders, leaving me, lying breathless and terrified inches below the frame, in the invisible, dangerous dark. The digital hum of the iPad speaker was the only sound in the room, amplified by the terrified pounding of my own heart as I lay flattened against the mattress, staring up at the underside of Elena's chin. Robert's voice filled the room, tinny and distorted by the connection, but authoritative enough to make my blood run cold. He was talking about a merger, about snow delays in Zurich, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was currently pinning his gardener to their marital bed. The camera angle was a razor-thin line between life and death. One slip of her hand, one shift in the iPad's position, and my face would be broadcast directly to him. But Elena wasn't just surviving the moment. She was orchestrating it. While her voice remained steady, offering polite, monosyllabic responses to her husband, her hand beneath the camera's view was wandering, tracing the line of my abs, her fingers trailing fire across my skin. It was a violation of every rule I knew, a twisted game of Russian roulette where the bullet was exposure, and she was pulling the trigger over and over again just to feel the rush. I had to bite my own lip to keep from making a sound, my body rigid with a mixture of paralyzed fear and an excruciating, electric arousal that I couldn't control. When the call finally ended, Robert signing off with a distracted, "I'll check the security logs later, go to sleep." The screen went black, and the room plunged back into heavy silence. Elena didn't move immediately. She stared at the blank screen for a long moment, her chest heaving, before the device slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the nightstand. The mask dropped instantly. The confident, predatory seductress dissolved into something far more fragile. She collapsed forward, her forehead resting against my chest, and I felt a damp warmth seeping into my skin. She was crying. It wasn't the hysterical sobbing of regret, but the silent, shaking tears of someone who had been holding their breath for years. "He didn't even look at me," she whispered, her voice muffled against my bare skin. "I could have been on fire, and he would have just asked if it was going to damage the upholstery." In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. She wasn't the boss's wife anymore. She was a lonely woman starving for a connection that her millions couldn't buy. I knew this was the moment to leave. My pocket began to vibrate. My phone, buried in my discarded jeans on the floor. It was likely my girlfriend, Sarah, wondering where I was, or my mom checking if I'd made it home through the storm. The vibration was a lifeline to my real life, a reminder of the safe, simple world I belonged to. But looking at Elena, feeling her vulnerability mixed with the lingering heat of her touch, I made a choice that felt like jumping off a cliff. I reached down, fished the phone out of my pocket, and without looking at the caller ID, I slid the power button to off. I silenced the world outside. I chose the storm. "I see you, Elena," I said, my voice rough but steady. "I'm not looking at the upholstery." It was a betrayal of my own life, a sacrifice of my safety for her validation, but when she lifted her head, her tear-streaked face transformed into something radiant and hungry. The shift from emotional confession to physical desperation was instant. We collided, no longer hiding, fueled by the near miss and the shared secret. But the world outside the bedroom wouldn't stay silent for long. Just as the atmosphere in the room grew heavy and heated, a beam of harsh white light cut through the gap in the heavy curtains, sweeping across the ceiling like a searchlight. The crunch of tires on gravel echoed from the driveway below, much louder than a passing car. It was inside the gates. Elena froze, her hand gripping my shoulder. "Private security," she hissed, scrambling off me and rushing to the window to peek through the crack. "The sensor trip earlier. Robert must have flagged it remotely after all. They're doing a perimeter check." My stomach dropped. If they saw my beat-up sedan parked around the back, or if they decided to knock on the door to ensure the lady of the house was safe, I was trapped. The reality of the danger crashed back in. This wasn't a game anymore. Men with flashlights and guns were walking around the house. I scrambled into my clothes, my hand shaking so badly I could barely zip my jeans. "I have to go," I whispered, the panic rising in my throat. "If they find my car—" Elena grabbed my arm, stopping me halfway to the door. The fear was back in her eyes, but it was mixed with a fierce, possessive determination. She didn't care about the guards outside. She pulled a small, silver key from the pocket of her discarded robe and pressed it into my palm, her fingers closing mine around the cold metal. "Take the servants' exit through the kitchen. It leads to the old path behind the hedges. They won't see you," she instructed rapidly. Then, she pulled me down for a kiss that tasted of scotch and desperation, a promise that this wasn't over. "This opens the side gate," she breathed against my lips. "Come back tomorrow night. Same time. Don't make me wait, Leo, or I'll tell them you broke in." I fled into the dark hallway, the key burning a hole in my hand, knowing I had just accepted a ticket to my own destruction. The escape from the Grayson estate was a blur of adrenaline and mud, a frantic dash that felt less like a gardener going home and more like a fugitive evading a dragnet. I scrambled through the servants' exit just as the heavy beams of the private security flashlights swept across the manicured hedges where I had been standing seconds before. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard, I thought it would crack them, the sound deafening in my own ears as I slid down the muddy embankment to the old service road where my car was hidden. I didn't turn on my headlights until I was a mile away, driving through the storm with white-knuckled grip, the silver key Elena had pressed into my palm burning a hole in my pocket. That night, I lay in my own bed next to my girlfriend, staring at the water-stained ceiling of our small apartment, listening to her soft, innocent breathing. I felt like a stranger in my own life. The world I knew, the safe, predictable world of paycheck-to-paycheck struggles, felt gray and lifeless compared to the terrifying Technicolor danger I had just tasted. I held the key in my fist under the pillow, the metal warming against my skin, and I knew with a sinking, heavy certainty that I wasn't going to throw it away. I was going back. The Leo who had walked into that mansion to water ferns was gone. The man who returned would be something else entirely. The next night, the storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and dangerously clear. Driving back to the estate felt like driving into the mouth of a beast, but I couldn't stop. At exactly 9 p.m., I parked my car in the shadows of the old oak trees outside the perimeter wall and made my way to the side gate. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying, silent weight, turning smoothly to grant me access to the Forbidden Kingdom. The house was dark, stripped of the chaotic energy of the storm, standing silent and imposing against the moonlit sky. I moved through the kitchen, the silence of the house pressing against my eardrums. She was waiting for me. Not in the bedroom this time, but in the library, sitting in a high-back leather chair with a single glass of whiskey on the table beside her. She wasn't wearing the frantic, disheveled look of the previous night. She was dressed in a silk robe that shimmered in the moonlight, looking every inch the queen of this castle. "You kept the key," she said, her voice smooth and devoid of the previous night's panic. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation of the contract we had silently signed. This was the climax of our dance, the moment the power dynamic settled into its permanent groove. I didn't offer excuses or hesitation. I walked across the Persian rug, the distance between us closing with a sense of inevitability. "I'm not here for the job, Elena," I said, my voice sounding deeper, rougher than I remembered it. "I'm here because you can't tell him. And you can't tell anyone else." She stood up, the silk robe slipping slightly, and the look in her eyes shifted from command to a raw, hungry relief. We came together not with the frantic desperation of two people afraid of getting caught, but with the deliberate, consuming intensity of accomplices sealing a pact. There, amidst the smell of old books and expensive leather, we crossed the final line. It wasn't just about the physical act, though that was overwhelming in its intensity. It was the surrender of our morals. I touched her knowing I was stealing from a man who could ruin me, and she touched me knowing she was risking her gilded cage. We were building a secret world right under the nose of the surveillance state she lived in, finding the blind spots in the cameras and in her marriage. 2 weeks later, the routine had solidified into a dangerous, addictive ritual. Robert returned from Zurich, the conquering hero of industry, completely oblivious to the rot in the foundation of his home. The first time I saw him after that night, I was pruning the rose bushes by the patio. He walked out, coffee in hand, clapping me on the shoulder with a jovial, condescending smile. "Garden looks great, Leo. You really put the work in while I was gone," he said, handing me a bottle of water. I took it, looking him dead in the eye, and thanked him, marveling at how easy it was to lie. I wasn't the nervous kid anymore. I was the man who knew exactly what his wife sounded like when she whispered my name in the dark. Elena walked out a moment later, sunglasses on, looking immaculate and untouchable. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. She kissed Robert on the cheek, playing the perfect wife, but as she turned to go back inside, her hand trailed along the stone railing, her fingers tapping a specific rhythm, 3 times. It was our signal. It meant the cameras in the guest wing were disabled for the next hour. It meant the game was on. I watched her disappear into the cool shadows of the house, the taste of the secret sweeter than any paycheck I had ever earned. I finished my water, picked up my shears, and prepared to head inside for my break. We had created a perfect, invisible crime scene, a pocket of chaos inside a fortress of order. And as I walked toward the side door, wiping the dirt from my hands, I realized the most dangerous thing wasn't the husband, the cameras, or the risk of losing everything. It was the fact that for the first time in my life, I felt truly alive. I touched the pocket of my jeans, feeling the cold, hard outline of the silver key, the only thing that was truly mine in a world that belonged to them.